Hello and welcome to this week's Tonai Talks with Kath Bailey. This is part of our Mythbusting series. If you haven't already, please take a look at our other videos in the series, some really helpful explanations and tips regarding a range of neurodiverse conditions. Today, we are going to be looking at social communication. Kath, would you mind giving us a little overview of what we're going to be talking about today?
Okay, thanks, Caitlin. Hi, everyone. So we're going to be talking about what social communication actually is. We're going to be thinking about why some children and people have social communication difficulties. And we're also going to be looking at autism, which is a social communication difference, in a little bit more detail.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Kath. This brings me to my first question of the talk, and that is, what is social communication?
Yes, a good starting point, Caitlin. So basic social communication skills are the everyday bread and butter behaviours that enable an individual to relate and interact with others. We know how essential that is. They provide the essential framework of skills that can be developed over time with regular practice. And it's proposed that there are 9 fundamentals of communication. So enjoying being with another person, enhancing concentration and attention span, developing the abilities to attend to another person, taking turns in exchanges of social behaviour, sharing personal space, using and understanding eye contact and facial expressions, using and understanding non-verbal communication, using vocalizations with meaning, and learning to regulate and control arousal levels. So there's a lot to do with social communication. It's not as straightforward as it might seem. Lots going on there.
Absolutely. I think when we because it comes so naturally to some of us, we assume that that's the case for everyone with social communication, and it seems like a kind of a very an important thing, because it's something that we do daily, but actually when we break it down, it's imperative, isn't it? It's really important to us engaging with other humans. So this brings me on to, so why is social communication important? I talked a little bit about it being part of our everyday. Why is it actually so important for us as social beings?
Yeah, well, obviously communication with others is absolutely key. We've said it's everyday bread and butter behaviour. I think being able to communicate effectively is really important. But I think it's really important for our listeners to know that when we're talking about communication, our natural tendency is to think about communication as being only about the spoken word. But we know that a lot of communication goes on between human beings without using the spoken word. So, for example, 55% of social communication encompasses body language. So we're not using any words with that. That's how we're using our body to communicate with others. 38% of social communication relates to the tone of our voice. So regardless of the words we're actually speaking, how we're speaking them says an awful lot about what we might be wanting to communicate to somebody else. And 7% only relates to the actual words that we use. So there's a lot going on when we're communicating with others, not just the use of words. And there are many other ways of communicating. Babies babble and use vocalizations such as da da da, ma ma ma, that communicates particular messages to caregivers. Children, young people may take or lead others by the hand. We wave, we point, we reach out, we tap, we use facial expressions, we use signs and gestures, we look and we gaze. So it's a very, very complex picture. And as I say, not just about effectively using the spoken word.
So there's some big purposes in there with social communication, isn't there? Connecting with other people, having our needs met without being able to communicate, what we're thinking and feeling. It can be really difficult to navigate life. We do know that some children, some individuals have differences in their social communication that perhaps make it a little bit more difficult for them. So why do these children have social communication differences?
Okay, well, when looking at a child or young person with social communication differences, it's very tempting to assume that they have autism. But it's really essential to remember that there is a lot of overlap with autism and other communication differences. So when looking at a child with social communication differences, it's tempting to assume that they have autism. But it's really essential to remember that there's a lot of overlap with autism and other communication differences. So when we work with children, it's really important that we don't jump to the conclusion and try to diagnose them. Observation, liaising with parents and working closely with other professionals are all essential when working out the profile of a child's strengths and need. And as we know, children may struggle with their social interaction or social communication for any of the following reasons. So it may be that they are autistic, in fact, that is very, very possible. But we also know that children who present with differences in their social interaction and communication, that can be caused by a number of environmental factors, such as they may have had few opportunities to build relationships with a responsive adult, for example. It could be that they've had a lack of experience with others, whether that's children or adults. And we know, with the COVID pandemic, that was a real issue of concern where we weren't allowed by law to interact with others on a social basis, or there were very tight restrictions around it. So that lack of experience, particularly in the early years, has had a significant impact on the later development of social interaction and social communication skills. It may be that there are issues around attachment, where the child has been unable to make a secure attachment with a caregiver early on in life. There may be other neurodiverse conditions at play, such as attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, for example. Children with these types of behaviours will also have differences in their social interaction and communication skills. And it also could be that a child may have global developmental delay, where all of the child's development is delay. So the social communication delay is in line with all their other developmental areas, such as development of physical skills, self-help skills, language skills, play skills, etc., etc. So the social communication and social interaction differences may be in line with their overall development. So there's lots and lots of reasons why children can present with differences in their social interaction and communication skills. And the important thing is, not to jump to the gun and think that that a child has autism in the first instance.
There's a lot of other kind of things there that definitely can cause those social communication differences, and it's really important that we kind of we give attention to all of those and we explore all of them when we're looking at a child's social communication needs.
Absolutely.
Even if just to rule them out. Something that we hear a lot about when we're talking about kind of social communication is this kind of like dyad of impairment. So I suppose, what is the dyad of impairment?
Yeah, okay. Well, we've already mentioned that social communication and interaction differences may be linked to a possible autism. And if this is the case, the medics, or what we would be doing is observing behaviours in what we call the dyad of impairment. And the dyad of impairment is what medics would be considering when looking at a possible assessment and diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder. What you can see in the diagram before you are a blue circle and orange circle. So what we'll be looking at in one particular area of the dyad is an impairment in social communication and interaction skills. And I'll be talking about what that looks like later on in the podcast. And also we'll be looking at differences in restrictive, repetitive patterns of behaviour. And differences in those two areas need to be observed across a number of multiple contexts. The differences need to be persistent, and the differences also need to be present in the early developmental period. Differences in these two areas would also need to cause clinically significant impairment in social, occupation, or other areas of functioning for a medical team to give a diagnosis of autism. But this is what they use in terms of their assessments in order to arrive at a conclusion around whether a child or young person meets the criteria to be diagnosed or not, if that makes sense.
Okay. So what might we observe then if we're kind of looking at a child with social communication differences?
Okay, well, if we think about that first area in the dyad, which relates to social communication differences, what we might observe is a child who constantly interrupts. So in a class, they are not understanding the need to wait their turn or put their hand up, but they just need to, say the things that they want to say immediately. So you'll see constant interrupting. So they're not taking into account the needs of their listener or the fact that their listener may need to express what they want to say, feel, or think. You may see a child who uses pedantic or overly formal language. We often hear children talking in, like robots really, or sort of scientists, like, way beyond their developmental age or chronological age. So we see language that is overly formal. It may be that children use a different accent. We often observe children using an American accent, for example. And we also see children, young people, treating peers and adults in the same way. So they lack an understanding of social hierarchy. So, for example, they may speak to their friends in the same way they would speak to a head teacher or vice versa. So there is that lack of understanding about adjusting what we say and how we behave according to the social context that we find ourselves in. We also hear a lot of echolalia, which means that children hear others speaking and simply repeat the words that they have heard. We call that echolalia. We also may see a child struggling with understanding sarcasm, idiom, double meaning, banter. Certainly children can get very, very dysregulated and upset when there's sarcasm or banter used because of a lack of understanding. They may have difficulty following instructions, using creative language, using the pronouns me or you, and also they may struggle to understand and use social greetings. So those are some of the things we may observe in a child with social communication differences.
Okay, so what about if the child has social interaction differences? Because that's different necessarily from kind of social communication differences, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. So a child who is finding it difficult to interact socially, may have good social communication skills, but find it very, very difficult to actually engage in social interaction. Or they may have impaired social communication skills, which feeds into their ability to interact socially. It may be that they're very passive, that they actually are quite motivated to interact with others, but they don't actually know, how to do it, how to initiate with people. So that may result in them becoming very, very passive, and needing very, very specific directions about what to do now and what to do next. Or they might be very invasive. They might be in your face, as it were. So not understanding the subtleties around how we manage a social interaction in a kind of natural way. They may be very withdrawn and solitary. And as I said, it may be that actually they don't want to be on their own, but they haven't yet developed the skills or don't quite understand the skills that they need or the things that they need to do to initiate an interaction with others and maintain that interaction. It may be that they interact on their own terms only. So we often see children who will seemingly play with other children, but they're very much dictating the sequence of play, or may present as being bossy or domineering, but it's because they only are able to interact on their own terms. It may be that they interact only to have their needs met. So, whether they're hungry or thirsty or need the toilet, that is the only time they may be motivated to interact. They may point to things to request, but not necessarily to share interests. So, for example, it may be that they point to a packet of biscuits, for example, if they're hungry. But if they're walking down the road with their mum or dad and a plane goes over, they may not point to direct their parent or carer to the plane going over to share interest with them. And they might respond to, but not initiate interaction. So they may answer questions that are asked of them, but it'll probably be very kind of closed responses that don't lead on to further questioning. And certainly they wouldn't be initiating those initial interactions. A child may also struggle to see things from another's point of view, which impacts on their ability to empathise with others, and also to use eye contact. So those are just some. We see lots of differences, but those are just some of the things we might observe.
So am I right in saying then, Cass, that I suppose social communication is the way we speak to others, but then social interaction is more so the way we behave with others or towards
Absolutely,
others?
yeah, absolutely perfect, Caitlin. That's exactly it.
So we've talked about those two areas, but I'm wondering what would we observe in a child who had differences in the other side of the diet of impairment, so in the kind of area of rigid, repetitive, or restrictive behaviours?
Yeah, okay, that's a good question. So when children have got differences in this area, we may see children lining things up. Often we hear parents talking about children playing with their toys, but actually what parents then go on to report is that the children are simply lining up their trains, lining up their cars, lining up their dolls. So there's not really any kind of imaginative play going on. There's that simple just ordering and lining up of materials. Children may show very good attention to detail. So, have you heard that phrase, you don't see the wood for the trees? So it may be that when they look at something, they don't understand the gist of it, but they focus very much on the intricate detail. So, for example, if we looked at a picture, it may be a picture of a house. So if somebody said to us, what's that a picture of? We'd say a house. Whereas a child with significant differences in this area may say, well, actually, I see 4 windows, a door, a roof, a chimney, a garden path, a letterbox, a door handle, rather than seeing the overall picture of a house. So they show very, 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 very good attention to detail. They may demonstrate repetitive play sequences, which lacks imagination. So again, parents may report that their child does play imaginatively with cars, for example. But what we here, when we unpick this a bit further, is children perhaps just pushing cars back and forth, or putting their car on top of a garage and then watching the car drive down the what's the word I'm looking for? The path, yeah, or the road, yeah. And then they put the car back on the top and they watch it go down again. So it's a very, very repetitive sequence, just, you know, or the train going back and forth, the train track in the same way. So they're not really using their imagination to create play scenarios. They're doing the same thing over and over again with their favourite toys.
So it's more the movement of the toy rather than the kind of scenario. It's like, oh, you know, this train is going to this station, yeah. And, you know, the person inside the train is going to get off and they're going to go shopping. Yeah. It's more kind of the movement of the toy rather than creating, like you said, those play scenarios in which, yeah, the child is almost like acting out those life situations.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely, yeah. And children may also have obsessive behaviours or routines or fixed interests. So they go back to the, you know, the same toy over and over again, or the same television programme over and over again, or they may be particularly interested in a particular colour, so they'll only wear pink clothes, for example, or they may only eat certain foods. Or they may have to do things in a particular way. They may have quite ritualistic behaviour. So, for example, going to bed, you know, mum and dad may have put in a very structured bedtime routine, which a child then has to follow absolutely exactly according to that structure that and the routine that and the steps that the parent and carer have put together. And if a step is done in a different order or is missed out, the child can become very dysregulated and upset. We've talked about a limited range of interests. You know, again, that goes back to just having very, very fixed interests. Or special interests that children go back to over and over again. And they may prefer activities with adults rather than playing, which we often observe. They may struggle to show creativity with construction, for example. So, you know, when you think about Lego, you know, lots of children love Lego. And, you know, many children love creating their own constructions out of Lego, just making things up as they go along, you know, creating very abstract pieces. Whereas children who've got difficulties or differences in the area of rigid, repetitive, restricted behaviour may need to follow the Lego manual and build things in a particular way, following a particular schedule and schedule of steps. And may not have that ability to be creative in what they're drawing. And similarly with things like painting and drawing, they may need to copy things or only draw or create things that are within their realm of knowledge. So they may not know what a house looks like, so they can draw a house. But if you ask them to create something really, really imaginative, like a monster that they've never seen before, they may really, really struggle with that. And they prefer factual books, or can prefer factual books to fiction. They, you know, like reading about, you know, facts rather than stories which are imaginative, where there are characters which they have to read and understand. It's much easier to process factual information. So thinking about play, again, in a bit more detail, a child may have differences in their play skills. So they may struggle with let's pretend games where they, you know, mum is saying, right, you pretend to be the shopkeeper and I'll be the person doing the shopping. That kind of role play, pretend play can be very, very difficult. Writing or telling creative stories. Again, that's something that can be different for children. And also there may be a dependency or a need to have a very, very strict structured routine, and children can often become dysregulated or upset if there are changes to their routine. So I think, you know, those are the sort of the main differences that we see, but I think it's really, really important that we perceive these as differences, not difficulties, that children are just seeing their world in a different way to other children. And, you know, these differences can be very much perceived as strengths rather than difficulties. And it's about how we manage these differences to enable the child to reach their potential, that we'll actually be looking at in the next podcast. But these are things that we need to celebrate and really think about in a different way, rather than think about deficits, difficulties, which is very much a medicalised model of the pattern of behaviour.
Absolutely. And so if we kind of consider, we've looked at the dyad of impairment, if we consider beyond that, are there any other behaviours that we might observe?
Yeah, well, again, that's a really good question. Like, and you know, as I've said, it's very, very difficult to get this across in a podcast. But you know, every child is unique, whether they've got differences in how they present or not. Every child is unique. Every child is different. But what we often see in children with significant social communication interaction needs, and in the repetitive behaviours, are sensory difficulties, which can affect all of the child's senses. So they may be oversensitive or undersensitive to sight, sound, touch, taste, smell, balance, or body awareness. They may have difficulties with sleeping and eating. And again, we've talked about, you know, a bedtime routine. We've talked about eating particular food types. You know, they may have very, very restricted diets. We've also touched on emotional regulation while we were talking about social communication. And sometimes we see children with real struggles in how they regulate their emotions, which can lead to anger and aggressive behaviour. We often see children with poor spatial awareness or fine motor skills, and often we can observe some clumsiness in how they negotiate their physical environment. We often observe irrational fears or phobias, which can reach kind of obsessive compulsive levels. Some children may be overly cautious. Some children may have very limited sense of danger or their own safety. So it's a very, very complex picture, Caitlin, and no one child will present in the same way as another child.
There's a range of differences and behaviours that we've talked about today that are all to do with social communication and interaction, which has been really, really interesting to look at the kind of the full scope of what we might observe and what our children and young people might be contending with or experiencing. So we do have some kind of takeaway messages from today. If you wouldn't mind sharing them, please.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, you know, the key message really is that when we're considering a child or young person who may or may not be diagnosed with autism, or who may or may not be on a referral pathway for assessment for autism, the focus really should be on celebration of individual difference. You know, let's not talk about deficits and difficulties. Let's talk about the fact that children present in very different ways, and let's celebrate that notion that every child is unique and has an individual profile of strengths and needs which enrich our societies and our interactions with others. Let's hold on to the idea that it's the environment, not the individual, which brings the challenge. So the focus should be on how do we create enabling environments which value difference, whilst at the same time embracing the notion that autistic people may need care and support in a different way. And the focus needs to be on a needs-led basis rather than a diagnosis-led approach to support. Let's look at what that profile of strengths and needs are, and let's look at how we can enable the environment to manage those needs and celebrate those strengths, rather than focusing on a very within child model where we're looking at what the child needs to do differently to manage their difficulties or their differences. As I said, in the next podcast, we will be looking at ways of creating these enabling environments in order to provide the best support for our children and young people who present with social communication differences.
Something for you guys to keep an eye out for, definitely, after today's talk. So that's the end of our talk today. So diolch yn fawr. Thank you so much for listening and for joining us for our talk on social communication. We're very much looking forward to seeing you next week to look at how we can actually best support our children and people who are experiencing these differences and these needs.
Thanks everyone. Bye.